At the outset of the invasion, as the tandem cyber and anti-satellite strikes nullified all American communications and hence the ability to coordinate and organize and effectively lead any type of real serious defensive efforts, as well as the local jamming from the electronic warfare assets in many local regional battle spaces, adding its weight to jamming the redundant communications via pinpointing the origins of radio and radar signals and hence utilizing directed electromagnetic jamming to silence those as well. American forces had only been able to mobilize limited additional forces prior to the invasion, such as National Guard and reserve elements. Due to the suddenness and shockingly brutal and rapid nature of the invasion, many of these forces had never made it to their original destinations. One such example being the 2nd Battalion of the 134th Infantry Regiment, itself an airborne infantry battalion within the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team. It had been temporarily billeted in hotels located within the so-called entertainment district of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and their vehicles had been parked at adjacent urban parking areas that had been rented out by the state regime for their use for parking the battalion's vehicles. They originally had been intended upon being sent to the OG&E Frontier Power Plant and possibly the OG&E Mustang Plant as well. In lieu of the entire Oklahoma National Guard having not been able to be mobilized, only the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team was present at this battle within Oklahoma, at the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma battle. As the area from within which the 2nd Battalion, 134th Infantry Regiment was at had been heavily hit by massive long-range 300 millimeter rocket strikes inbound from the A300 Battalion, firing the A300 long-range rocket artillery systems, the longest-range artillery system in the world with a whopping 187-mile range, in support of the operations occurring in this battle, as well as at American armed militia forces having hit the earlier outcropping of these approximately 1,200 fairly well-equipped and somewhat well-trained American militia forces, which themselves were led by a cadre of former American military with ample experience beneath their belts. These rockets being fired in support of this ongoing operation had laid waste to enormous areas of the city, including the entertainment district primarily, as well as the northwestern portions of the outer northwesternmost suburbs of the metropolitan area, as well as being hit in conjunction by the artillery battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade with its firing batteries equipped with the Type 83 self-propelled 152mm howitzers, now beginning to shift their fire to support the battle ongoing at the Will Rogers International Airport, which by 3 a.m. was in full swing as the forces had arrived really before 3 a.m. at 2:30 a.m. when they had captured the adjacent Federal Transfer Center prison compound, which had runways running up to it as part of the airport. Although not the airport terminals proper, it was a part of the overall immediate vicinity of the international airport, with military police from the Headquarters Battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade, along with the Air Defense Artillery Battalion, the whole of its firing batteries, participating in this battle with their very potent PLA E.W self-propelled air defense artillery systems with their quad 25mm autocannons, although they didn't use their FN-6 surface-to-air missiles, as there were 4 of them per vehicle, as these are strictly only useful against air targets. The quad 25 autocannons could be aimed at ground or air targets manually, as the weapon systems could be aimed automatically via the radars on each vehicle, or they could be manually aimed by the operators. And these forces provided enormous firepower, backing the military police company from the Headquarters Battalion of the 17th Combined Arms Brigade's Headquarters Battalion, and also the drone section within the Headquarters Battalion itself had lobbed a fresh volley of CH-901A loitering munitions, which also supported the ground forces partaking in this particular operation, as these loitering munitions looked for enemy troops, whether in trenches or in or on top of or outside of buildings. Cruise missile strikes began to crash into the area from YJ-18C container-based cruise missiles as well, with local ISR assets directing the combat here just as everywhere else. These forces were making rapid headway at the same time as the Special Operations Battalion, the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion, was dropping off its last 2 companies, one company being dropped off by the Transport Helo Battalion, making shuttle trips, dropping off a company at a time between 2 specific areas, the eastern pocket that was developing, created by the special operators inserted into this area from 2 of its standard operator companies, with support from a squad of the FPV drone section, as well as a robotics operator squad and the sniper and spotter squad, which had 5 teams within this squad, which itself was even part of the robotics operator platoon, as it was paired with the robotics operators that operated the quad-legged W-85 heavy machine gun armed quad-legged robots that fired these potent 12.7mm machine guns as a mobile, highly destructive fire support platform for the operators. As that was occurring, the other last company to be flown in was dropped in the now secured LZ, or the landing zone, of the original companies that were flown in during the phased withdrawal from the battle they were involved in first against the American militia forces that were backing up a armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion from the 190th Combined Arms Brigade. As these companies were pulled out one at a time, the first company flown into the area was dropped to secure a landing zone to help formulate the western pocket of the downtown area. These pockets would become important as together they would comprise the red zone, or the zone of occupation following the defeat of America within the invasion phase of this conflict, shifting over to an occupation phase wherein there would be a continuation of combat, only it would be for the Americans an attempted war at liberation, and for the Chi-Coms it would be a war of empire and occupation, as they would be exploiting the land, the resources, and its people for gain of their nation. As this was going on, the bridges over the Oklahoma River that connected the entertainment district to the downtown formerly had been rapidly seized by the second company flown in and held by platoons belonging to that particular company of operators, as the last company to be flown in would participate directly in the capture of local regime elements, as in the local administrative element of the Oklahoma City, Oklahoma area at the City Hall, as they, too, were to be captured just as the state officials were being captured, including the state military leaders of the Oklahoma Army and Air National Guard that were also in the CAP complex. As this was underway, these two battles would become inexorably linked due to the fact that the forces from the 58th Special Operations Independent Battalion participated in both to a degree, even the battle with the 2nd of the 134th, as well as the mechanized infantry troops of the Battalion of Mechanized Infantry from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade that had been moving up through the south-central portion of the entire metro area adjacent to I-35, moving into the area to engage and eliminate the remainder of the 2nd of the 134th and its personnel, as their vehicles had almost completely, entirely been eliminated by this point by the heavy rocket strikes, the artillery strikes, loitering munition strikes earlier on, and strikes from two DF-21A tactical ballistic missiles that not only destroyed a few LMTV trucks parked on the adjacent street to the hotels being utilized by personnel of this unit, but also the hotels themselves being hit with a high degree of precision, as the intel was ascertained by the Chinese cyber warfare arm, tracing the financial transaction records of these hotels being rented for the purpose of billeting troops before they were to be deployed to guard critical infrastructure, and therefore they had been placed on the targeting list for the operation occurring in this local battle. As all of this was happening, these American forces that had survived the initial barrage at the first sign of artillery fire had wisely taken initiative and went underground into the city's labyrinth of underground tunnels, sewers, and maintenance tunnels, sewers, and deep basements below relatively strong concrete reinforced buildings that had taken the brunt of the beating that was levied upon them by the 300 millimeter rockets, 152 millimeter artillery shells, and other munitions that had landed upon them, leaving the buildings above the street level as completely battered, unrecognizable piles of rubble, or at the very least, buildings that were on the outskirts of direct strikes as completely gutted facades that exposed the interiors of these buildings at all levels, as the walls had completely collapsed and some of the roofs had pancaked into the street, which would make, to an extent, the clearance of those buildings a bit easier, as they would be quite simple to breach from the gutted walls of the structures, although the completely rubble-piled buildings would be a bit more difficult. And the Chinese would suffer some casualties in this particular battle, as the Americans would take advantage of the rubble and emerge and engage the oncoming forces of the mechanized infantry troops, as their Type 89A armor personnel carriers and their brand new state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry VN-20 infantry fighting vehicles would be conducting a hammer and anvil maneuver against the airborne infantry troops in this part of the city, as they would be moving into the area to essentially cordon off and sweep the massive piles of rubble that had been created by the gargantuan barrage of rocket and howitzer artillery, as well as the DF-21A tactical ballistic missiles landing on two very specific hotels that were being utilized by the troops of this battalion. Fortunately for the battalion, not all of the troops were present in these hotels when these strikes occurred, with roughly 2 companies worth of the troops having had survived to even go underground in the first place. Although they weren't homogeneous companies in the sense of actual companies with a unit number, they were the remains of the companies that had now amalgamated together to fight the onslaught of the invasion forces now rapidly moving into the area. These 2 maps that were linked together, the high-value capture operation that was occurring a kilometer to the north of the battle that was occurring in the entertainment district with the 2nd Battalion of the 134th, was happening a kilometer to the north of the battle that was occurring in the rubbled entertainment district, as this particular area of downtown had not been essentially horribly destroyed or gutted yet, as no major fighting had occurred in this particular section of the city, as this was only a 1 by 1 kilometer area where this map is highlighted, although to the north of the area, heavy artillery shelling had been underway from the artillery battalion of the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, having had shelled the other firing batteries in the headquarters battery of the 1st of the 160th into complete ruination, leaving only some ground troops left alive that had taken underground, like the troops of the 2nd of the 134th that had survived that barrage, only to re-emerge and set up a pocket of resistance, along with reactionary armed civilians and a small number of paramilitary forces operating at the local level that were within this area of downtown, as the special operator companies would fan out and would receive assistance from half of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion moving in the area from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade, breaking its 8 companies into half of them moving into across the bridges of the Oklahoma River into the downtown area, and the other half, 3 Mechanized Infantry companies and the fire support companies staying to clash with the 2nd Battalion, 134th Infantry Regiment, or essentially the 2 companies worth of troops, or 220 men that even remained of it. As the initial skirmishes began, when the battalion moved into the area, the entertainment district, with American troops beginning to emerge from beneath the ground, no longer hearing the massive array of artillery from 300mm rocket and the 152 artillery strikes, not to mention the 2 DF-21A tactical ballistic missiles that completely obliterated an entire city block each. These forces emerged from the manhole covers, from the deep basements into either a rubble pile, depending on what occurred to the building they came up from, or a quasi-intact building to fight the oncoming troops of these companies from the battalion that had been left to essentially clear these troops from this particular area when it came to the defenders, clearing the defenders, while other companies had proceeded north. Although these maps begin almost around the same time, they end at very different times. This map would last far longer than would this map, as this map begins literally only 15 minutes after this map here of the entertainment district, which is completely left in total ruination. This map would last a grand total of almost 3 hours time. It would last until nearly 6 a.m. from 3, when the Hammer Force was dismounted, which was the squads of dismounted troops from one of the 3 mechanized infantry companies left in the area, with the fire support company even further to the south, beyond the company cordoning the south off map, as there were 2 combat platoons spread out from another company to holding the eastern perimeter, with 1 further platoon off map. As these squads just over 2 platoons worth right in this particular area had been dismounted from their vehicles to the west. They had already encountered and eliminated some American troops by the time they get to this position where they begin in this map, as this begins at about 3:30 and ends at 6 a.m. or minutes before 6 a.m. essentially, in more precise terms. The special operators tasked with, from one of the 4 companies of special operators and the portions of the heavy special weapons company that had been left in this particular area around the western pocket, which includes most of the FPV drone sections of the FPV drone platoon, with only one having gone to the eastern pocket operations conducted by 2 regular operator companies, with 1 robotics operator platoon, the sniper and spotter squad, which there is only 1 in the robotics platoon, and 1 robotics operator squad from that platoon operating in this particular area, with all of the mortar troops operating in the western pocket, firing their mortars, their 82mm mortars, in support of the other operators within this area. There were a company of operators off-map to the west of this map, and another to the south, which was the company that was holding the bridge, and 1 company landing in the area with yet another company a bit off and to the east, as they were now moving into position to create the cordon with the mechanized infantry troops rapidly rolling up. There were 2 companies moving up this way, with 1 already on this map before the other 2 begin to arrive. The first company, having had moved up this street, went this way and around the city hall, with its headquarters setting up at this parking garage, and in front of it, with it sending a squad to watch the back of the operation from the parking garage, while the last of the special operator companies was inserted in via helo to conduct and support the operation now occurring, with a whole platoon of operators from the company that was to the west sent in with support from this mechanized infantry company to capture the high-value local individuals. By the time this map begins, the other 2 companies that would be passing through this area here and here were just now crossing the bridge behind the first company, which was here to get into place. While this map opens up, there's a squad in a wedge formation and 1 in a rolling T in the north, with FPV drones being sent across the Oklahoma River from the FPV drone sections, as they were in high demand, and operating FPV drones in support of the mechanized infantry troops tasked with clearing this entire rubbled portion of the city, which was in a 1.5 by 1 mile area by the time they reached this point, as they'd already cleared areas to the west of this and to the southwest as they were moving just to the south of this map and across the same area of rubbled buildings that these other squads are moving through from the company holding the western cordon that had dismounted their troops to serve as the hammer force to the anvil force that was blocking in a blocking position. The first actions that occurred were, as these troops of the special operators across the river had captured and held these bridges for their compatriots of the mechanized infantry to cross without the American troops returning to the area and possibly destroying them, or at least that was the thinking in the minds of the operational planners, they had already by now cut down this squad that had emerged from a manhole covering between these buildings right here and went behind these rubbled buildings that had been hit by 152mm shells and destroyed. And an FPV drone had been sent over and helped in eliminating these troops, with these 2 squads laying down heavy small arms fire, barrel-fired 35mm grenades from beneath some of the QBZ-95 or 03 rifles that these troops operated, as they had their special pick of weapons, and both the QBZ-03 and 95 fired the same ammunition type, as these were special operators and they could pick their own weapons as it was tailored to their mission requirements. And they fired some of their extremely ubiquitous Type 69 RPG ammunition, whether the anti-personnel or anti-tank, depending on the specific targets they were firing at, as, again, almost every PLA soldier had access to these, and they were kept in large amounts within the armor personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles of the PLA, as well as MRAPs and trucks, as these had been produced in simply freakish quantities over the decades, and using them in massive numbers was one way to clear out old stocks. While these troops advanced, they had begun to encounter Americans running out from a wooded area that they had seen, by the way, with their ISR quadcopter reconnaissance assets, as these had IR and night vision imaging and could see all of the movement that occurred out in the open, although movement occurring in rubble was a bit more difficult to see, as the rubble piles were still quite warm in some areas from the recent strikes. The movement in the streets and across the open ground was extremely easy to see with night vision and IR, while night vision would mostly suffice for having to see movement in the rubble piles, that they were still relatively warm and smoking from the strikes, as mentioned. These special operators holding this bridge on this side of the river had engaged with these forces, opening fire upon them as they turned to fire back at these two squads that now bounded and covered tactically with one another, with this squad having started here, with this squad bounding ahead, laying down fire, as they were laying down fire from this side, with an FPV drone coming over the river and eliminating the point man and the soldier immediately behind the point man of this group right here. While this group over here was being engaged by vehicle fire the moment these vehicles got to the very end into this park right here, as this was a portion of the city's Riverwalk area, as there was a Riverwalk behind these former businesses, restaurants, and stores and such that crossed the street into this park right here, where there was a basketball court. These troops by the court, by these trees as well, were trying to fight, but they were hit by an FPV drone and ample small arms fire from these two squads here, and vehicle fire from here. And the fire was, of course, as always, ISR and AI and data link, combat data link directed. These forces, continuing to bound and cover tactically, encountered a squad of troops that had just come out of the rubble that used to be a portion of this city block right here of different buildings. And as they tried to go around the corner, as they peered around the corner and prepared to tactically move across the street, they were rapidly engaged by these forces who had laid down heavy volumes of fire on them, firing some of their rocket-propelled grenade rounds, their anti-personnel rounds, tube-fired 35mm grenades, and small arms, eliminating these forces as they were spotted the moment they emerged and into this courtyard between all these buildings. As they were securing the flanks and FPV drones were starting to make their way over, FPV drones engaged this squad that had been spotted moving up this street, while this squad was also engaged by FPV drones and vehicle-based fire. While this was going on, something else had occurred that was unforeseen, although it was spotted, as these vehicles had steady quadcopter reconnaissance drone ISR assets per every squad, orbiting their vehicles in a wide arc to be able to see around them adequately. And this building had hosted American troops that were coming up and out of the basements of it. This particular plaza of buildings, this city block of buildings, had not been destroyed, as prior to this, there had been no Americans in this particular area over here. And thus, the only Americans that were spotted were in this area and to the southwest and west. And these Americans had come up from across the street through a maintenance tunnel into this building, and now were coming out of it and were spotted. And were now being engaged by the troops of this double column rolling shield formation, as well as passing vehicles like this MRAP at the end, firing their heavy machine gun at them as they passed, but they continued rolling as they had other missions to attend to, and they were eventually all cut down and eliminated, even as this half squad tried to peer around the corner and fire back while the rest of them prepared to tactically cross the street to this group of buildings here. But they did not make it. They were fired at by troops over here, passing vehicle, firing down there, and the troops right here, and they were cut down with a fastness, with a quickness. The headquarters platoon of this company had moved into the area, dispatching 2 different squads to check the building here first, as this was an unforeseen event of these troops emerging from it, and they then checked all the other buildings around it, as the headquarters platoon was supposed to come into this plaza anyway to be relatively in the middle of their forces in order to be able to be in a spot where they could quickly distribute supplies, and also the command elements, the company captain and XO and the head NCO over the combat company could direct their forces as needed. While that was all happening, the squads that were covering the streets acted as essentially flank clearance for the troops that were going through and clearing the buildings and or rubble piles. This badly gutted large hotel building had not been occupied by Americans prior to the fighting, but now was, as they had again taken the labyrinth of underground tunnels, sewers, and basements into this particular building. There were 3 full squads of American troops in it, and these 2 Chinese PLA squads were breaching the building and now taking them in firefights throughout the corridors. Even early on, this rolling T had been for the man on the end to be able to watch at the windows of this intact portion of the building in case they needed to fire upon them, to give this entire squad here a full 360-degree security perimeter around it, and to back up their squad in the wedge formation, as the wedge was a better formation for the park they were coming up upon on this side of the street, while the rolling T was good for use against these buildings of this side of the street. With this squad taking the street with rubble spilling out literally into the middle of it to the corner and holding their position until radio contact is made with the squads inside clearing this building that they had cleared it, they would hold their positions at the end of the building here and right across the street here before they moved a bit further to be aligned with this squad and this squad. As this group had already been eliminated, this group of American personnel, they moved up and crossed the street as the forces were finishing up inside this building to be in a position where they would begin to be able to move ahead again to be parallel with the forces clearing this city block. While that was happening, this squad here began to move through this rubbled former large building right here, while this squad in the rolling T formation to move through the street had already been engaging 2 half squads of Americans that had been spotted on the edges of the rubble buildings that were here and had by now eliminated them with well-fired 35mm grenades, also RPG anti-personnel ammunition, and small arms. As all of this was ISR directed, they had many more advantages over the Americans, although one thing that sort of made things a bit more even in this instance was the fact that the Americans, although they didn't know when and where the Chinese were and where they were coming from, they had rubble that they could fight from, which made the movement go far more slower than in other battlefields within the larger Oklahoma City battle, as they had eliminated this squad of troops, or these two half squads. This other force was moving to the end of this rubble pile and was engaging these half squads here, these two half squads, while this squad in the staggered column formation moving up here assisted them in this with two squads, this wedge and the staggered column, where because the street is diagonal, they went and cleared this rubble pile and then moved up together, while this other squad went through this area and moved on the southern end of this rubble pile that was formerly a building before preparing to cross the street after finding nothing. These squads, this one, and these two here, had engaged these two half squads and completely annihilated them. Although when this single squad here, this staggered column, was moving through this area, these Americans had stayed still for a relatively good amount of time. And they had got the drop on the Chinese. As they were passing, they began to fire up and over some rubble at them, and return fire had initiated, although the PLA had lost a KIA right here. They had lost a KIA, but they finished off this American squad while that occurred. And this squad here, that started here, had 2 WIAs. By this point, after these squads had eliminated these Americans, these two squads in this rubble pile that were pretty well broken up, as one full squad was here and another squad was broken into 4 groups throughout this, that ringed this courtyard area. As they had 2 WIAs from this squad and 1 KIA from this squad, one of the helos had to come in to pick up the WIAs, and security had to be pulled around this area, but not before this squad had moved into this area and eliminated this American squad with the help of this squad that got the drop on these Americans emerging from the rubble out of the basement that was beneath this former city block right here, where they were spotted by ISR assets, and the Chinese troops snuck up on them, got the drop on them, finished them off, and then came around here before moving down in here to help this squad moving through this area methodically pincer this group right here and finish them off, before itself then moving to clear this rubble pile with this squad here, which moved into this area after this city block had been cleared by these 2 squads that had cleared this building in some heavy fighting. They moved and cleared this rubble pile that was a former building, along with this squad that just ambushed these Americans emerging from underground there and moved here. And they both held their positions here while this squad moved into this area. This squad moved in and ambushed these 2 half squads, or full squad essentially, on either side of the street, while the rest of the troops held their position for the medevac to come in, pick up the 2 wounded troops and the KIA and fly them out of the area, as this squad had suffered a KIA and this one 2 wounded. So the helo hovered over this area. They loaded the 2 WIAs on the aircraft and the KIA, and then they flew out. But that wouldn't be the only KIA or WIAs, as more fighting would continue. By this point, by the time they'd even made it here, it was already 4 a.m., as all this movement took a lot of time to occur, as this was nitty-gritty urban combat, and movements in urban environments took ample time, as all these forces were at the end of these areas here, and now we're here. By the time they all reached this area here, it was now coming up on 5 a.m. And these forces had gotten into a fight here even before then, before 5. It was about 4:45 when these 2 squads that moved through here together had reached here. They got into a back and forth, which lasted until 5:15. This was a 30-minute firefight here from 4:45 to 5:15. While this other squad continued moving to hold the flank. So again, there were a few more squads to the south spread out over another city block area, while these 12 squads were in this area here. And all of that occurring finally led to them catching up to this area where all these other squads had paused to wait for them to catch up, as all of this was being coordinated together by about 5:30. These last two blocks wouldn't be completely cleared until around 6 a.m. As all of that was happening, they moved through this area. They got ambushed. This same squad that took some WIAs here got ambushed, and they lost their first KIA from this squad. So this squad, now 3 men short, had 7 men left, but they were still just on the edges of being combat effective by the time they wiped these guys out. They would have to hold their position and wait for the helo to come in and get the KIA before leaving the area, while this squad moved in right here. While this squad was busy clearing this large building, which had a squad inside of it and one emerging in this courtyard right here from beneath all of this rubble coming up out of a manhole cover that was adjacent to it. And as they were going through clearing this squad out, initially this squad had fired upon the squad outside, moving along the flanks that stopped at this corner and exchanged fire with the troops inside the building. And as this squad hurried around, they continued to fire in a rolling T, with the guys on the end firing up at this building as they moved over to clear this building. And they did so because this was the last group of buildings on the very end, and they were near their other own troops. So they had them to fall back on if worst came to worst. And as that was happening, this squad that was busy clearing this building had finally eliminated all these guys, and as they were spotting this emerging squad coming out, they wiped these guys out from inside the building. They ambushed them, firing down at them from higher floors, and they wiped these guys out. They wiped this whole squad out. They got completely ambushed because they were spotted first as they were emerging. Now these last 2 buildings were cleared down here by these 2 squads who ran between them in this little alleyway right here, cleared this block, with this squad clearing it with them, and the last squad moving in with them, and they held their position in here, and these squads held their position in here. This last squad moving here, while this squad got into a firefight with this American squad that had been well hidden within the rubble. And again, this would take quite some time to finish. While this squad had gotten a back and forth with this squad, but pursued them into the area as they were chased out and were ambushed by the vehicles waiting for them. Same happened with this squad here. As they were ambushed from the troops when they reached here, they ran out and exchanged fire with the vehicles and troops in the rolling shields behind them, but they were eventually annihilated by the squads coming up and ambushing them as they were being pursued and outflanked. As this one was in a wedge, you could fire this way or down in this way. After this one had been defeated, this area had been cleared, and these guys had been KIA'd, wiped out. That was cleared. As this squad left this city block, coming out of this gutted building, they had gotten into a firefight with these troops here, as these troops had been KIA'd early on from the vehicle fire, from loitering FPV drones, and this squad had gotten into a firefight with this squad and had KIA'd one of the soldiers in this squad, while the rest had wiped this squad out with rocket-propelled grenades, small arms fire, hand grenades, and even tube-fired grenades toward the end of the block here, and the 35mm grenades. And then after that had occurred, they held their position and waited for the helo to come in and pick up their KIA, while this squad had basically been tasked with clearing this last block up here while these troops held their positions as the Anvil force. This squad, and this squad moving through this area along this street were tasked with clearing this area where a huge fight was now underway between these forces holed up in this courtyard area and these 3 squads. This one squad entering through the gutted building from its exposed floors, this one coming up through the rubble portion of the building, and this one coming up from rubble. But these troops were using the rubble to their advantage. They managed to KIA another Chi-Com soldier and wounded 3 more from this squad, but they couldn't get any from this squad, who were now firing out of windows. So there's another KIA and 3 more WIAs. All in all, even at the severe disadvantages the Americans had, they still managed to cause a group of 7 KIAs. They caused 7 KIAs and 4 WIAs throughout this entire occurrence against the mechanized infantry soldiers, because they had used the rubble to their best advantage. And even though the enemy had severe advantages over the American troops, who are essentially now even more disorganized, as these were mixed groupings of troops and they weren't part of any homogenous companies from within the battalion, they had basically shown that they had some heart. They put up the best fight they could with the small arms they had, and they were horribly low on supplies too, because most of their supplies that were above ground had been destroyed with their vehicles early on by the artillery. So essentially all they had was what they carried for the most part, and they put up the best fight they could, but they were completely slaughtered, because you can't really fight without supplies and ammunition, and also you can't really fight an enemy that has total advantage in ISR assets, technology, vehicles, equipment. But sometimes it's the spirit of the fight. If you have heart and you have the willingness to fight back, sometimes you can pull some things off that wouldn't be imagined before, such as eliminating essentially a small handful of Chi-Coms and wounding some others, which essentially took them out of the fight, as they would have to be taken for medical treatment. While that was occurring, the battle in the north, a kilometer away to the north, was far less lengthy, as this 1 by 1 kilometer area was already surrounded on 3 sides by special operators, while more were penetrating this area as the mechanized infantry troops were moving into the area and surrounding the city hall. This will be covered in the next video, as there isn't quite enough time to fit within this particular video, although this battle is linked to this battle, and for the most part, more or less, is part of this particular battle in the entertainment district, although this battle is occurring in downtown a kilometer away, but is being carried out by the same units in terms of the mechanized infantry troops that were involved in the area, giving support to their special operations forces comrades, and of course the forces belonging to the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion itself, doing much of the heavy lifting in the HVT-capture operation, as well as some of the flank securing operations, and doing the heavy lifting in terms of creating the pocket along with the mechanized infantry troops who were brought in to assist in this endeavor as well, as their forces would be leapfrogging in a way, as 4 companies already moving into this area, 2 of which would be continually going north, while those who would be wrapping up their combat in the south, a kilometer away in the entertainment district, would then be moving to the north. And although the fire support company didn't contribute really to this battle, as it was decided to methodically clear these areas, and these areas were already so horribly rubbled, and all they really had were their heavy mortars and 130 millimeter rockets, they had decided it would be a better use of these weapons to assist their companies that were over a kilometer away by this point, as they were about 2 kilometers away or just over a mile away, as the PLL-05 heavy mortars, the 120 millimeter heavy mortars, which were very destructive, and the 130 millimeter short-range light artillery rocket multiple launch rocket systems had a 5-mile range for the rockets and a 5.5-mile range for the mortars, and they would be utilized to directly support the 2 companies that were getting to the outer cordon of the western pocket first, where they were fighting quasi-type guerrilla elements of the 1st of the 160th, who lost all their artillery equipment and vehicles, and now had to basically fight on as infantry forces, who would be now taking a note from the troops further to the south of the 2nd of the 134th, the Airborne Infantry Battalion. Although they didn't know what these troops were doing, they were basically doing the same thing by this point, intuitively, trying to get underground to flee the light artillery from the fire support company of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion operating in this area that was part of the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade, as well as to essentially get down there the moment the heavier artillery from the 152 millimeter Type 83 systems had already begun hitting their vehicles and destroying them in the opening barrage. They were wise to go underground, just like the troops of the 2nd of the 134th. While troops in other areas didn't necessarily have this advantage, like troops that were in more suburban areas, although there were some instances of underground or hardened areas they could use. By the time the invasion fully started, there really wasn't enough time for them, as they were closer to enemy units at the very beginning, to be able to take advantage of this until it was really too late for them. While other units that had a bit more time, as heavy barrages were coming in the northwest of downtown and in the entertainment district or the south central portions of the city proper, these forces had time to basically get underground when the first shells began to come in. Even before the 300 millimeter rockets began to come in, these shells let them know that something horrible, horrifying was unfolding, and they needed to get away as quickly as possible by any means necessary. This will continue in the next video with the high-value target operation, the capture operation of the city officials at the City Hall in the next video, which we'll be going right into as the helos drop off the last special operator company from the Z-20 helos of the Transport Helicopter Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment, being backed up by the heavy forces consisting of mechanized infantry troops rolling into the area to back them up by providing security, additional security.